So this morning, we're looking at continuing here, and we're starting chapter 5 of 1 Peter. And this is, it's about shepherding. And this honestly was just insanely convicting to me personally. This is probably aimed more at me than any of you. But starting off here in verse 1 of chapter 5, he says, I exhort the elders among you. He says, as a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, as well as a fellow partaker in the glory that is to be revealed. So Peter is like this. He's like, I know pretty much exactly what you're going through. And he says, as a fellow elder, an elder could be, it's really a name that could be used for many positions. An elder is used for like a preacher or a teacher or a shepherd or someone who is giving spiritual guidance in the church. But he's like, I'm one of those. He says, I know exactly what you're going through. He says, I know the struggles. I'm doing that myself. And he says not only that, but he says he's a partaker. He's well aware of the sufferings of Christ. He knows, he's seen Jesus Christ himself suffer. He's seen the suffering of his children. He knows what it's like in a hard world. He knows exactly the things that we're going through and we're enduring, and which would make him probably an excellent shepherd to understand the sufferings that happen. And then he says this, and then he says, and I'm also a fellow partaker in the glory that is to be revealed. He knows what it's worth to live for Jesus Christ because he is going, he has his eyes set on heaven. He's like, he says, I'm living for the same goal as you all are. He says, I'm right there with you. And so then he says this. He says, and he's speaking to people who would shepherd a church, people who would look out for people in a church, people who would be doing a similar thing that he does. And he says this, he says, shepherd the flock of God that is among you. He says, exercising oversight. He says, not under compulsion, but willingly as God would have you. And he says, not for shameful gain, but eagerly. He says he wants them to be doing these things for the right reasons. And I thought, there's a lot to think about in this. He says, shepherd the flock of God that is among you. First of all, do your job. And then he says, and exercise oversight. And I think, as we think about this, we know what shepherding is. If you were a shepherd and you're shepherding sheep, you're gonna bring them to water. You're going to bring them to food. You're going to look out for them. You're going to keep them from danger or cliff sides. And in the same way, if you're shepherding people, you're going to bring them to learning. You're going to bring them to understanding. You're going to guide them to God. You're going to give them the spiritual nutrition that they need. And you're going to watch out for dangers, for enemies, for cliffs. You're going to be like, hey, that's something you shouldn't do. You shouldn't go near that. You shouldn't be involved in that. You're going to be constantly vigilant, watching over people. If you're shepherding, you're going to be looking out for things, and you're going to be doing a good job watching over the people that you're watching over. You're going to be practicing those things. And when he says exercising oversight, this to me was pretty convicting, honestly. I'm going to be honest, there's a lot of things that are kind of convicting in this. But as he says this, as he says exercising oversight, what does that mean? Put yourself in my shoes. God is like, exercise oversight. And I think, as I think of, if I were to leave my children or you to leave your children, generally you put the oldest one in charge. Not always, but generally you would be like, okay, or maybe you'd have a babysitter. You hire a babysitter, whatever you do, and you're like, exercise oversight while I'm gone. What is your expectation? What did you just ask of them? What has God asked of me when he says exercise oversight? That's a pretty interesting thought to think on, because it's kind of saying like, you're responsible for obedience for these people, right? That's a pretty powerful statement to make. And if you leave someone in charge of your children and you come home and they're just sitting on the couch eating potato chips and the kids are just breaking every rule there is, who's going to be in trouble? The kids? Well, yes. Who's going to be the first one in trouble? The one who is told to exercise oversight. The one who is told to keep a watch on the things. The one who is told to be like, hey, no, don't do that, right? And I think it puts things in a quite a bit different light when we think about the job of exercising oversight. And I want to look at some things in Jeremiah and Ezekiel about what a good shepherd is. And I want to point out that if you pay attention, Peter is going to list pretty much the exact same things that he's talking about. So this is like, I think, a super fitting passage, and I wouldn't even be surprised if Peter was really almost referencing these passages when he talks about what it is to be a good shepherd. And he says in Jeremiah 23:2, he says this, "Thus says the Lord God of Israel concerning the shepherds who care for my people." He says, "You have scattered my flock, and you have driven them away." And he says, "You have not attended to them." He says, you haven't kept them in order. You haven't kept them together. You haven't been amongst them, doing your part, like watching over them. You haven't been vigilant. You haven't been doing a good job at all. And then he says this. He says, "Behold, I will attend to you." And he says, "For your evil deeds, declares the Lord." He's like, and when he says, "I will attend to you," that's not the same sort of attending that he asks shepherds to do. That's the sort of "I will attend to you," like wait in the kitchen by the wooden spoon, right? As the wait in the woodshed, because I'm coming to attend to you. That's not the good "I will attend to you." That's the bad "I will attend to you," because you were not a vigilant shepherd. You didn't take a personal interest in the people in your church. You didn't watch over them. When they went astray, you didn't help, right? You were not attentive to their following rules, right? You weren't attentive to what they were supposed to do. And he says that he's going to come and he's going to attend to them, to the shepherds. Then in Ezekiel 34:2, he says this. He says, "Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds." And he says of Israel, prophesy and say to them, even to the shepherds. He says, "Thus says the Lord." And he says, "O shepherds of Israel, who have been feeding themselves." He says, "Should not shepherds feed sheep?" He says, "You guys who have been, you come home and the babysitter's, stuffing her face, and the kids, maybe it's been a week, and the kids haven't eaten. They're literally starving. But the shepherd is well cared for. He's taking care of himself, but he hasn't looked out for the needs of their sheep. He hasn't been making sure that, like, from a shepherding standpoint, he may be on track, but his people aren't. They're not living as they ought. They're not getting the spiritual teaching they need. They're not being guided in the way that they should. And he's like, wait a minute, why are you just looking over you and not looking over them? He says, what is the problem with you? What kind of shepherd are you? And then he says this. He says in verse 3, he says, "You eat the fat." And he says, you clothe yourself in the wool. And he says, you slaughter the fat ones. But he says, you do not feed the sheep. And he says this, he says, you eat the fat and you clothe yourself with the wool. And he says, there are privileges to being a shepherd of a church. There are things that are good about it. He says, you're just like, oh, this is a nice new wool coat. This is, lamb chops, beat that. There's benefits to being the preacher in the church. There's benefits to being the shepherd of people. This is nice, but you're not doing your job. He says, you're not amongst them people doing the things that you're supposed to do. Aren't you supposed to be making sure that they have what they need to do what is right, to walk in the truth? And instead, you're just looking out for yourself. And he says, I think we need to look at this as more than a job. We need to look at it as a shepherd. This isn't just something that you're like, oh, hey, look at the benefits in for me. What does that pay? Hey, I'll do that for a while. At least until it, goes away. As long as there's people there, I'll take that position and I'll just kind of roll with that. And if it dissolves, oh well, I got something else in the works, another job lined up, right? He says, you're thinking about this as if it's about you, and you're not thinking about the people in the church, right? You're not caring for them. You're not looking out for them. He says you're fixed. You had your mind fixed on yourself. He says when you're taking this position, and then he says this. He says in verse 4. He says the weak you have not strengthened, and he says the sick you have not healed, and he says the injured you have not bound up, and he says the strayed you have not brought back. And he says, the lost you have not sought. And he says this, and he says, and with force and harshness you ruled over them. That's not good. That's not good. He says this. He says, first off, he says, the weak you have not strengthened. And I think about this, and I think, to my chagrin, I don't even know the word I'm looking for, but the weak you have not strengthened. And this is just like, I can't tell you how much like I care about people who are in the church, who are like, maybe they've just been saved, they've just been baptized, and you see maybe they come up sometimes, maybe they show up once a month, or maybe like here they are, they're essentially they're weak, right? They're not been built up into a solid and firm Christian. And so many times I think to myself, I love them, I care about them, I wish, and I don't how would you say it? I don't personally come alongside them as strengthen them like I should, right? I don't seek to. I guess there's a lot of things I think I don't say. Maybe that's a man trait, right? There's a lot of things I think and I don't say, and I don't want to look back on my life and think, man, I regret that, but unfortunately I do already, right? And so this is something that as a shepherd, you need to make sure you do. The weak, you need to make sure you strengthen them. And he says this, he says, the sick you have not healed. And there may be people in the church who are living in disobedience, and they're doing things they shouldn't do. And you should have come alongside and been like, hey, you need to cleanse those things from your life. You need to straighten up. You need to get on track. But is that an easy thing for a shepherd to do? It's a lot easier to stand up here in the pulpit and just say things, but have I come alongside as I should? I'm more quiet than I ought to be, and unfortunately, again, I was just like, overwhelming conviction, like things I think and don't execute, right? These are things I need to do, and these are things that are so important as a shepherd of the church, and I think I've got to do better on those things. And he says, the injured you have not bound up. And I think, there's so many people who maybe they've just gone through a struggle. Maybe their things have collapsed in their life. Maybe they've fallen into great sin, or maybe their marriage has collapsed, and maybe their relationships have collapsed. Maybe they're just in the depths of like crushed, right? And the shepherd is supposed to come alongside and brush them off and stand them up and be like, Let's walk with the Lord again. Let's get back on track. There's restoration for you. Come on, let's get back where you need to be. Let's make sure I bind those wounds, and let's make sure that I'm helping you to get back where you need to be. And so often again, there's a lot of things I think in my head, and I think I do care about these people, but again, I've failed. Yes, definitely. Definitely, I should come alongside stronger and to pull harder to bring people back who are down. Is something that I definitely feel there's almost an I should do better. No doubt about it. So he continues on and he says this. He says, the strayed you have not brought back. And how many times have we thought of things? And maybe there are people who are lost. And I thought of if you had a babysitter and you came home and they're like, well, one of the kids left, and you're like, one of the kids left. Yeah, I don't know where they went. And you're like, you were responsible, right? And I think when I was writing out this message, I was saying this is probably a bad thing because I've been known to lose a kid now and then. But I wrote in my message, I was like, I literally penned out, I was like, but I've never left one at like Walmart or something. And I left one at the YMCA yesterday. Whoops. Message crashed. I might get fired after this one. But anyway, in all fairness, I didn't know for sure I was supposed to bring that one back with me. But anyway. As a shepherd in a church, that's enough. It was funny, but not that funny. As a shepherd in a church, there are people who are in the church. There are people, you've seen them in here, and then they're gone. Did you go chase after them, right? Did you try to bring them back, right? Did you go to get them and make sure that they're back in amongst us? Did you go and seek them? Did you do that? Did you make sure that when they're not here that you bring them back? And a lot of times you think to yourself, well, they want nothing to do with me. I'm not going to interfere with their life. But is that a good shepherd? Is that good? Should you not have thrown yourself down to be like, hey, come back and walk with the Lord, because with the Lord is the only truth and right? Shouldn't you have been there and shouldn't you have done that? Shouldn't you have at least put that effort out to make that effort? Should, and not done enough. There are people in this town that I should at least, it's a hard thing to do. It really is. You can care a lot about a person, but getting yourself to go and be like, what happened to you? That's not easy, I am telling you, but it's something that I must do better. It's something we can all work on, right? But again, it's not that I don't care about people. I am heartbroken so many times for these issues, but I don't do it well enough. I don't do it well enough, and this is something that I should do. And he says this, he says, the strayed you have not brought back, and he says, and the lost you have not sought. He says, he's just like wild sheep in a field. And he's like, you didn't try to bring others into the fold. You didn't try to reach out for sheep that were lost. You didn't try to bring them into safety before ultimately, in a spiritual sense, they would die or be eaten by wolves. But in a certain sense, it would be like they would die without Jesus Christ. And yet you didn't try to bring them in and shepherd them. You didn't try to guide them. You didn't reach out for those who are lost. And I think this is something we can always do better on. We can always work towards making sure that we're reaching out for people who have needs. And then he says this. He says, with force and harshness you ruled over them. And he says, you just, like, your attitude towards them was like, I'm the boss. Mom left me in charge. Like, you have to. That's not what God wanted out of us, right? That's not the kind of shepherd he was looking for. If you left someone in charge of your children, you wouldn't expect any beatings. You wouldn't expect a lot of fighting. They're not your children. You're watching over them, right? And you would expect that they would just be carrying out your rules. You would expect that they would be like, hey, this is what God would want you to do. This is what's right. And I am frankly in trouble if you don't follow God, if I don't try to bring you in line. But I'm not in harshness being like, hey, I am in charge, and you do what I say. Like, I'm the boss around here. Just like I do have the right to say that. You have the, No, that is not the kind of shepherd he's looking for. Not with harshness, not with force, not ruling over them in that way. But that you'd be an example, that you'd be caring, that you'd be loving, that you'd be someone who would work with them because they care about them. And then he says, so going back to what Peter is saying here. In 1 Peter chapter 5. In verse 2 he says, shepherd the flock of God that is among you. And he says, exercising oversight. Watch out for them, watch over them, make sure you're doing your job. And then he says this, he says, not under compulsion, but willingly. He says, as God would have you. Don't be like, oh, hey, like, I have to get paid to do this. In fact, it's my job, so I'm just going to do it. Like, that's not the idea. Like, if it's not in the heart, you're just totally missing the point. No, for God, for what is right, for what is good, for the love of what is good, do your job. Not because of that. And he says, not for shameful gain. He says, but eagerly. You have to care about this, right? It's not a job for somebody who thinks of it as like, oh, if you pay me enough, I'll do that. I can do that. It's not about that. You shouldn't do it for money. You shouldn't do it for something that, like, it has to be done for the right reasons. It absolutely has to come from the heart. And as we think about this, if someone were to think about, how much would somebody pay you, or how much can you get out of it? And I think, when Jeremiah and Ezekiel were talking about this, and saying like, it shouldn't be for what you can get out of it, and what's in it for you. And I think so many times, this gets upside down, and there are needs in a church, right? There are financial needs, and there are things that, if I worry a lot sometimes, not a lot, but sometimes I think, hey, if no money comes in, the church does close, right? But that's not the idea. We should be reaching out to people and kind of just, in a certain sense, just trusting that other people will carry the burden and will give. But we're not reaching out for money. We're not reaching out for things. We're not looking at it as what we can get out of these people. And I think also, and again, I don't even know if I should point this out, but it is an interesting thing. Some people look at this and they say, well, you shouldn't pay somebody to work in ministry. It's not about that. But in a certain sense, there's a yes and a no to this. And one is, both the Old Testament and New Testament say the laborer is worthy of his wages. And they said even someone who labors in preaching and teaching is worthy of double wages. But that cannot be what they're doing. That cannot be. Like, if someone steps into that position for that reason, then they're the wrong person for that position. And it's just one of those things where there's a bit of a catch-22 that you just have to make sure that as a shepherd, that you have no desire of greed that's driving you, that this is not your motivating force, that this is not the reason that you're in this position. He says, and then he says, Peter also says this. He says, very similar to what they were saying in the Old Testament. He says, not domineering over those in your charge, but being an example to those who are in the flock. And again, man, I think, am I a good example? In some ways, maybe, but in other ways, I do a lot of foolish things. I was thinking, again, dumb stuff. I was thinking, I a lot of times, for some reason, I always come up behind Davey on the road. Anybody else ever do that? And I get a kick out of it. I go flying past him. I think it's just the funniest thing. And that's not really a good shepherding thing, to be honest. I do a lot of dumb stuff that I'm just like, come on, grow up, right? Have problems. I no doubt about it. If you know me, you know that, right? Not always a good example. And I think there's so much to work on here. There's ample conviction. But I just hope that, as we think about this, kind of drawing this to an end, like, making sure I'm not domineering, making sure that I'm trying to labor in kindness and gentleness with people, especially those who I'm trying to correct, not out of obligation, but willingly, that I do want to do this. That is my heart's desire that I would do this. And that is something that I do believe I have, but there's just endless work I can put into that. Not for shameful gain or for money. Again, there's times in everyone's life where they're like, hey, you do have to make some money, but on the other hand, have to put that aside. You have to completely ditch that. You can't let that be a concern to you. Certainly, like, I do hope and I believe, and as my driving effort, that I would do this for free if I can, right? That has to be the purpose, that I love the people of God enough to do this, and that is my driving force. And then, be an example to the flock. Man, I got to try harder. I've got to do better. I got to pick up my slack. I got to try. And I hope I can work on that. And then lastly, Peter says in verse 4, he says, and when the chief shepherd appears, he says, you will receive the crown of unfading glory. And I think, that sounds really good, that a shepherd would receive a crown of unfading glory. But you can't stop there. You got to say, or he'll say, I'll deal with you, wait by the woodshed, right? There's two sides to this. A faithful shepherd would receive a crown of unfading glory, and a bad shepherd, maybe they wouldn't be as excited about that. It's a serious job. There's a lot of weight it entails. It's a very serious matter to shepherd over this. So in closing, did I exercise oversight? Did I look out over people? Did I try to guide them? And you guys can help me on this, because it's no fun to correct someone. It is not. And you have to be understanding if I try to carry that out. But did I exercise oversight? Did I teach people the Word of God? Did I bring along the truth to you and try to explain to you what is right and how we should behave and live? Did I carry that out? And I think, oftentimes I failed, but I think the thing about leading and being an example, there's a beauty in it that you put yourself through it first. Like, first I need to focus on me. And then I need to be like, hey, if I can lead, if I can be an example, and if I can, with love and care, come alongside and try to encourage you, I would hope that, I guess here's my goal, that we all work on this together, right? I work on it, and you work on it, right? Because I can't stand here and say that I'm just here, this great person ready to correct everyone, right? But as I work, I try to lead, and as I try to do that, I hope that you guys try to respond and follow and do what is right, that we all may stand qualified before God. So I guess that's my goal here. But anyway, let's go ahead and close in a word of prayer this morning. Our God and Father, this is an almost a frightening passage or a giant and monster challenge that you would ask of people to shepherd your church, that you would ask them to truly live out what they're supposed to, that they would be focused on what they're supposed to, that they would do the job that they're supposed to, that they would pour themselves into people as they're supposed to, that they would exercise some level of guidance, even in a serious sense, and then in another sense exercise a level of love and care to bring people along. And I just pray that you would just help that to come to be here in this church, and that you would just be with the work and those who lead and help these things to be carried out as you would wish they would. And I just pray that each of us here would follow after you, that we would walk and follow after you, the good and perfect shepherd, that we would be guided by you primarily, Lord. And I just pray that you just help us to live for what is right and to do what is right and to walk and follow after you. And I pray this in your Son's name. Amen.